What if the most confident voice in your head is not the wisest part of you, but the fastest part of you? That question sits underneath Daniel Kahneman's thinking, fast and slow. The book is famous for System 1 and System 2, but its real force is larger than a two-label model. Kahneman is asking why intelligent people, trained professionals, investors, doctors, judges, managers, voters, researchers, and ordinary families can feel certain while making errors that are not random. The errors have patterns. They come from a mind that must move quickly through an uncertain world, a mind that builds stories before it checks statistics, trusts coherence before it checks missing evidence, and turns feelings into reasons before slow thought has fully arrived. Kahneman gives the two systems as a useful fiction, not as two little people inside the brain. System 1 is fast, automatic, associative, emotional, and effortless. It reads faces, hears threat in a voice, completes familiar phrases, reacts to a sudden sound, and supplies first impressions. System 2 is slower, deliberate, effortful, and able to follow rules. It calculates, compares, resists impulses, and checks an answer when checking feels necessary. The trouble is that System 2 is not a tireless supervisor. It is capable but lazy. It often accepts the first answer System 1 provides because effort has a cost. Imagine a simple puzzle appears on a screen, and an answer jumps into your mind before you have finished reading. What would most people expect from a smart mind? They might expect intelligence to catch the trap. In fact, Kahneman shows that intelligence often arrives after the first answer and becomes a lawyer for it. The result is humbling. The mind that makes an error is also the mind asked to detect it. The opening movement of the book is therefore about attention. Mental effort is real. When System 2 works hard, attention narrows, self-control drains, and other tasks become harder. A person holding a difficult number in memory has less capacity left for another demanding choice. A driver can hold a conversation on an empty road, then fall silent in dense traffic. Attention behaves like a budget. Good judgment cannot depend only on heroic concentration because the budget is limited and the spender is reluctant. System 1 fills that gap by making the world feel coherent. It associates one idea with another, treats ease as a sign of truth, notices surprise, invents causes, and builds a model of normal life. This is not a defect. Without it, ordinary living would be impossible. But the same machinery that lets us move smoothly through the day also makes us vulnerable. A repeated sentence feels truer. A clear font feels more credible. A good mood makes an argument feel easier. A story that hangs together can feel more reliable than a pile of incomplete facts. One of Kahneman's most useful phrases is WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. System 1 works with the evidence in front of it and often ignores the evidence that is absent. The mind does not naturally ask how much it does not know. It asks whether the available story makes sense. That is why confidence can be so misleading. Confidence often measures coherence, not truth. A small amount of evidence can produce a very strong feeling when it forms a clean story. Think of a hiring committee reading a polished recommendation letter, hearing a confident interview, and seeing a smooth career story. In this hiring choice, what would you expect the committee to trust? The obvious answer is the candidate's visible quality. But the actual risk is that the committee may be judging the coherence of a presentation more than the future performance of a person. The missing data, the base rate, the role fit, and the noisy conditions of success may never feel as alive as the story already in the room. This is where Kahneman turns from the two systems to heuristics and biases. A heuristic is a shortcut, and shortcuts are not always bad. They help us estimate, decide, and move when full calculation is impossible. But under certain conditions, they create systematic mistakes. The law of small numbers is one early example. People expect small samples to behave like large samples. A tiny school, a small hospital, a new manager's first quarter, or a few days of market movement can look meaningful because System 1 sees patterns quickly. Statistics is colder. Small samples are noisy. Extreme outcomes happen more often in small samples than intuition expects. That lesson reaches far beyond research design. A team wins 3 games and looks transformed. A new employee has 2 bad weeks and looks doomed. A fund manager beats the market for a short period and looks gifted. Kahneman's warning is not that all small evidence is useless. It is that the mind does not feel sample size properly. It feels the story first. System 2 must ask the dull question. How much evidence is this, really? Anchoring shows another weakness. An initial number pulls later judgment, even when the number is arbitrary. A price tag, a first offer, a suggested donation, a random number on a wheel, or a prosecutor's sentencing request can influence the estimate that follows. People adjust away from the anchor, but usually not enough. Sometimes System 2 starts from the anchor and stops too soon. Sometimes System 1 searches for information that makes the anchor plausible. Either way, the first number changes the mental landscape. Picture a negotiation where the seller opens with a number that everyone knows is too high. What would you expect a rational buyer to do? You would expect the buyer to ignore it. Instead, the anchor still bends the conversation because every later number is now judged in relation to it. The result is that an irrelevant starting point can become the silent center of a serious decision. Availability is the shortcut that estimates frequency by ease of recall. If examples come to mind quickly, the event feels common. Vivid stories, recent news, dramatic images, personal memories, and emotional examples can outweigh quiet statistics. This is why a rare but terrifying event can dominate public fear, while a more ordinary risk remains neglected. Availability is not foolish. Common events often are easier to recall, but vividness can impersonate probability. Kahneman deepens this with the effect heuristic. Feelings guide risk judgments. When something feels frightening, people tend to judge it as more risky and less beneficial. When something feels attractive, they tend to judge it as less risky and more beneficial. Emotion compresses 2 questions into one. Instead of asking how likely and how beneficial something is, the mind asks how it feels. That is efficient, but it can distort public debate, investing, health choices, technology fears, and personal decisions. Representativeness creates a different kind of trap. The mind judges probability by resemblance. If a person sounds like an engineer, we guess engineer. If a description sounds like an activist, we choose the richer activist story even when logic says the broader category must be more likely. The famous Linda problem makes this visible. A detailed story about Linda makes bank teller and active in the feminist movement feel more likely than bank teller, even though a narrower category cannot be more probable than the larger category that contains it. The error is not stupidity. It is narrative fit. A rich story feels more like the person, so System 1 mistakes resemblance for probability. This matters every time a decision maker falls in love with a detailed scenario. More detail can make a prediction feel truer while mathematically making it less likely. The mind rewards a story for being satisfying. Probability does not. Kahneman keeps returning to base rates because base rates are the discipline that stories resist. If you know how often similar cases succeed, fail, recover, relapse, arrive late, run over budget, or deliver value, you know something important before you inspect the special case. The inside view asks, what is unique about this situation? The outside view asks, what usually happens to situations like this? The inside view is vivid and flattering. The outside view is often boring and more accurate. Consider a project team with a beautiful plan, talented people, and a deadline everyone wants to believe. What would you expect them to forecast? Most teams forecast from the plan they can imagine. But the result Kahneman wants them to face is the reference class. Similar projects usually take longer, cost more, and encounter predictable surprises. The outside view does not destroy ambition. It protects ambition from fantasy. Regression to the mean is another place where intuition invents causes too quickly. Exceptional performance is often followed by more ordinary performance because luck and noise contributed to the exceptional result. A very high score is likely to move closer to average next time. A very poor result may improve without any special intervention. But the mind loves causal stories. Praise seems to weaken performance when the next result drops. Criticism seems to improve performance when the next result rises. The apparent lesson can be false because regression was already doing the work. This is one of the book's quiet moral lessons. If we misunderstand randomness, we reward and punish badly. We credit leaders for lucky rebounds. We blame teachers, doctors, managers, and parents for noisy variation. We build rituals around outcomes that were never fully under control. Kahneman does not ask us to stop caring about causes. He asks us to stop inventing causes where chance is a better explanation. The section on overconfidence gathers many of these mistakes into a larger picture. Human beings believe their stories too much. Hindsight makes the past feel more predictable than it was. Once an event happens, the mind rearranges the evidence until the outcome seems natural. We forget how uncertain the situation felt before the result. This damages learning because we judge past decisions by outcomes and underestimate luck, ambiguity, and missing information. Kahneman's work with expert intuition is careful. He does not claim that intuition is worthless. Expert intuition can be powerful in environments with regular patterns and quick, clear feedback. Firefighters, chess masters, nurses, and skilled professionals may recognize meaningful cues because the environment has trained them. But intuition is weak in low-validity environments, where patterns are noisy and feedback is delayed or misleading. Stock picking, long-term political forecasting, and many strategic predictions often feel more knowable than they are. Imagine two experts making confident forecasts about a complex future. What would you expect confidence to reveal? You might expect it to reveal accuracy. Kahneman's answer is sharper. Confidence often reveals the coherence of the expert's story and the expert's ease in telling it. The actual test is whether the environment is regular enough and feedback rich enough for intuition to have learned anything dependable. The planning fallacy is overconfidence turned into a calendar. People underestimate costs, delays, obstacles, and coordination problems because they focus on the plan itself. The plan is orderly. The future is not. The inside view highlights intentions, steps, and desired outcomes. The outside view asks how similar efforts have gone. Kahneman praises reference class forecasting because it forces the decision maker to begin with reality outside the current story. Optimism receives a balanced treatment. Optimism fuels entrepreneurship, persistence, and invention. Many valuable projects would never begin if people saw the odds with perfect sobriety. But optimism also produces avoidable losses when people ignore competition, uncertainty, base rates, and failure. The book does not simply tell us to become pessimists. It asks us to design better procedures around our optimism. Premortems, outside views, independent estimates, checklists, and decision rules that force missing evidence into the room. A premortem is simple and powerful. Before a project begins, imagine that it has failed, then ask why. This changes the social permission structure. Doubt no longer sounds disloyal. It becomes the assignment. Risks that were privately felt can be publicly named. The premortem is a System 2 tool built for groups whose System 1 story is too smooth. The book then moves into choices, and here Kahneman's collaboration with Amos Tversky becomes prospect theory. Traditional economic models often imagined people evaluating final states of wealth. Prospect theory says people evaluate gains and losses relative to a reference point. The reference point changes everything. $1,000 can feel like a gain or a loss depending on what the person expected, owned, or almost had. Loss aversion is central. Losses hurt more than equivalent gains, please. Losing $100 usually feels stronger than gaining $100 feels good. This asymmetry shapes bargaining, investing, ownership, risk, and everyday resistance to change. It helps explain the endowment effect. Once people own something, giving it up feels like a loss, so they demand more to sell it than they would have paid to buy it. Picture a mug handed to half the people in a room while the others receive nothing. What would you expect the mug owners to charge if markets were perfectly neutral? You might expect a price close to what buyers offer. Instead, ownership changes the reference point. The result is that the same object becomes more valuable when losing it is on the table. Loss aversion also explains why negotiations can become painful. A concession is not experienced as a neutral adjustment. It feels like giving up something already possessed. In organizations, reforms can fail because each group feels its losses more intensely than it feels the larger gains. In personal life, people may stay with bad defaults because the cost of changing is felt more sharply than the benefit. The reference point becomes a quiet prison. Kahneman also examines rare events. People can overweight rare events when they are vivid, described, or emotionally charged, and ignore rare events when they are only abstract possibilities. Lotteries and insurance both depend on how small probabilities are represented. A tiny chance of a huge gain can become attractive when imagination supplies the picture. A tiny chance of disaster can become terrifying when the image is concrete. But when rare risks are not emotionally available, people may neglect them completely. Imagine an insurance choice where the same tiny probability is described once as a dry number and once through a vivid disaster scene. What would you expect to change? The probability has not changed. In fact, the result can change because attention changes the emotional weight of the rare event. Framing changes decisions without changing facts. A medical treatment described by survival rates can feel different from the same treatment described by mortality rates. A policy framed as employment can feel different from one framed as unemployment. The logical content may match, but the emotional path changes. Kahneman's point is not that framing is a cheap trick. It is that human preferences are often constructed in the moment, shaped by description, reference point, emotion, and attention. Mental accounting adds another layer. People organize money into separate accounts in their heads. Rent money, vacation money, winnings, losses, sunk costs, treats, savings, and daily expenses. These accounts can help self-control, but they can also distort choices. A person may treat a bonus as free money, keep a losing investment to avoid closing the account in pain, or drive across town to save $5 on a small item while ignoring the same $5 on a larger purchase. Broad framing is one remedy. If you face many small risks over time, it is often better to evaluate them as a set rather than as isolated emotional events. A single small loss can feel painful. A policy that wins over many repetitions can be wise. This matters for investing, insurance, business decisions, and personal choices where narrow framing makes every loss feel like a fresh emergency. Regret is one reason narrow framing has such power. People often imagine the pain of being responsible for a bad outcome. and that imagined regret shapes the choice before the outcome exists. An action that causes a visible loss can feel more blameworthy than an action that quietly produces the same or worse result. Kahneman shows that anticipated regret can make people avoid choices that would be reasonable across many repetitions. The mind does not only calculate outcomes. It imagines the story it will have to tell about itself afterward. That is why decision policy matters. If every decision is judged separately, each possible loss receives its own emotional trial. If repeated decisions are governed by a policy, the person is less exposed to the panic of one case. An investor with a broad policy can tolerate a small loss as part of a long series. A manager with a hiring rubric can resist the halo of one charming candidate. A family with a spending rule can avoid treating every discount as a fresh emergency. The policy does not remove judgment. It protects judgment from the weather of the moment. Imagine a doctor deciding between two treatments where one choice feels safer because the possible harm from action is easier to picture. What would you expect if the doctor thinks only about this patient and this possible regret? The safer feeling option may dominate. But when the same decision is viewed across many similar patients, the result can change because the policy sees the pattern that the single emotional case hides. Kahneman's appendices also matter because they remind us that the book is not merely a list of popular bias names. Behind the narrative is a research program about judgment under uncertainty and choices under risk. The early work with Tversky challenged the idea that people naturally reason like intuitive statisticians. Their prospect theory paper challenged the idea that value is simply final wealth. The book's public language is simple, but the intellectual movement is radical. Ordinary judgment is not just imperfect. It is predictably shaped by mental operations that can be studied. That research spirit also explains the book's caution about corrections. A clever slogan will not make the mind statistically humble. A person can know about anchoring and still be anchored. A person can explain availability and still overreact to a vivid event. A person can teach loss aversion and still feel a loss more sharply than a gain. The knowledge is valuable, but mainly when it is built into procedures, environments, and conversations that catch errors before pride seals them. Now the book turns toward the two selves. Kahneman distinguishes the experiencing self, which lives through moments, from the remembering self, which stores and evaluates the story afterward. These selves do not always agree. The remembering self gives special weight to peaks and endings and often neglects duration. A painful experience that ends less badly may be remembered more favorably than a shorter experience with a worse ending, even if the total pain was greater. Imagine two medical procedures. One is shorter but ends at peak discomfort. The other is longer, includes all the same discomfort, but ends with a milder final minute. In this medical choice, which would you expect people to choose again? Logic might favor the shorter total pain. In fact, Kahneman shows that memory can prefer the longer procedure because the ending changed the story. The result is unsettling. The self that chooses later may be serving memory more than lived experience. This distinction changes the way happiness looks. Experienced well-being, life satisfaction, mood, memory, meaning income, health, relationships, and attention are related but not identical. Asking how happy people are with life is not the same as measuring how they feel during the day. The focusing illusion makes this harder. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. When attention lands on one factor, that factor expands. The focusing illusion appears in judgments about location, income, career, marriage, status, illness, and almost any life condition. People may exaggerate how much one change will transform daily experience, because they are focusing on it at the moment of judgment. Kahneman is not saying circumstances never matter. He is saying attention magnifies the selected circumstance and hides the rest of life. The remembering self turns a spotlight into a story. Across all these sections, the book's practical message becomes clearer. Kahneman is skeptical that individuals can simply notice their own biases in real time and correct them by willpower. The mind is too fast, the story too fluent, and the error too invisible from inside. Better thinking often requires structures outside the individual moment. Rules, checklists, independent estimates, reference classes, slow meetings, pre-mortems, and other people who are allowed to challenge the story before the outcome is known. That is why Kahneman's phrase, intelligent gossip, matters. We see biases more easily in others than in ourselves. Instead of pretending this weakness will disappear, we can use it. A group can create language for error, anchoring, availability, base rate neglect, planning fallacy, loss aversion, hindsight, substitution, narrow framing. The label does not make anyone immune. It gives people a way to interrupt the story while there's still time. Imagine a group reviewing a decision before the outcome is known. What would you expect if the group has no shared words for the likely errors? The discussion may stay polite and vague. In fact, naming the bias gives dissent a useful shape before hindsight hardens the story. The most practical question in the book may be this: what question did my mind answer? System 1 often substitutes an easier question for a harder one. How good is this candidate becomes how confident did they sound? How risky is this investment becomes how afraid do I feel? How happy am I with life becomes what mood am I in today? How likely is this event becomes how easily can I recall an example? Substitution is dangerous because it is silent. We think we answered the real question. Kahneman's examples also show why humility must be specific. It is not enough to say, I could be biased. The slower question is, which bias fits this situation? If the evidence is small, ask about sample size. If the first number was loud, ask about anchoring. If one story dominates, ask about WYSIATI. If a risk feels vivid, ask about availability and effect. If a plan looks unusually smooth, ask about the outside view. If a loss feels unbearable, ask about the reference point. Specific humility is useful because it gives System 2 a task. The same discipline applies to organizations. A good meeting should not merely collect confident opinions. It should separate facts from interpretations, collect independent estimates before discussion contaminates them, define the reference class, make assumptions visible, and ask what would have to be true for the preferred story to fail. A culture that punishes doubt will get beautiful stories and weak decisions. A culture that makes doubt useful can keep ambition while reducing self-deception. Picture a leadership team approving a major expansion because the market story sounds irresistible. What would you expect if everyone speaks after the highest status person gives an enthusiastic opinion? Agreement will probably arrive quickly. In fact, Kahneman's work points toward a different design. Gather independent judgments first, expose the base rate, force a pre-mortem, and only then discuss the story. The result is not cynicism. It is a decision that has survived contact with missing evidence. A stronger decision process slows the substitution down. Name the actual question. Ask for the base rate. Look for missing evidence. Separate vividness from probability. Treat confidence as a cue to inspect, not a verdict to obey. Use the outside view before the inside view becomes too persuasive. When mistakes are repeated, use a policy. When the plan feels beautiful, run a pre-mortem. When a number appears first, ask how much it is anchoring the room. When a loss feels unbearable, ask whether the reference point is controlling the judgment. The book's humility is important. Kahneman does not teach that slow thinking is always right or that intuition is always wrong. Fast thinking is the reason we can live at all. It recognizes, reacts, speaks, reads, loves, fears, and moves before calculation could begin. Slow thinking is precious, but it is effortful, limited, and often asleep. The goal is not to replace System 1 with System 2. The goal is to know when speed is trustworthy and when a decision deserves structure. That structure can be modest. A checklist before diagnosis, a second estimate before a budget, a cooling period before a purchase, a written rule before a repeated risk, a base rate question before a forecast, or a dissenting voice before a launch can all do what private intention rarely does. They make the invisible visible at the moment when the mind most wants to be finished. Thinking, fast and slow, remains powerful because it changes the moral feel of error. Bad judgment is not only ignorance, laziness, or foolishness. Often it is the ordinary result of a mind doing exactly what it was built to do. Simplify, associate, explain, predict, protect effort, and create coherence from fragments. That should make us less arrogant and more careful. The person most vulnerable to a bias is often the person who feels most certain that the story is obvious. Return to the opening question. What if the most confident voice in your head is not the wisest part of you, but the fastest part of you? Kahneman's answer is not to silence that voice. It is to stop mistaking speed for truth. Let intuition speak, but do not let it be the only witness. When a judgment matters, bring in the base rate, the missing evidence, the outside view, the reference point, and the possibility that the question answered was not the question asked. Fast thinking gives the mind its first story. Slow thinking earns its value when it has the courage to ask whether the story is true.